Hi everyone, welcome to the second GLA webinar. We're just waiting one more minute to allow a couple more people to sign on and then we'll get started. So please bear with us for another minute. Thank you. Hello again, everyone. Welcome to the second GLA Gender webinar on mainstreaming gender in the project cycle. My name is Celine Meijer, and I am a program officer with the IUCN Global Gender Office, and it is my pleasure to facilitate the webinar today. Before we get started, I would like to share a couple of logistical notes quickly. So your microphones are automatically on mute. And if you would like to ask a question, then please type your question in the comment box or press the raise your hand button. And then once we get to the question and answer section, we can unmute the microphone for you to ask a question. And if you have any technical difficulties, please try and leave the webinar and then rejoin it again. Hopefully that should solve any problems. However, if your problem persists, then please send us an email and we will try and help you out as best as we can. This webinar will be recorded and we will share the link with you afterwards so that you can listen back to the presentation later and share it with colleagues who are not able to join us today. And then I will want to extend a special welcome to our Francophone participants today. They are joining in this session through an interpreter who will be doing a live translation of the presentation as well as the question and answer. We hope that everything will work smoothly, but please bear with us in case we have to repeat or clarify anything for the French speakers. And also as a reminder that we cannot speak too fast to allow for the translation. Before I introduce the speaker for today, I would like to say a few words about IUCN's Global Gender Office. The GGO enjoys worldwide recognition for its extensive 20-year body of work addressing gender equality issues across various aspects of the environmental sector and in the larger context of ensuring equitable, sustainable development. We are an international team with decades of combined experience across the gender and environment field, and we work to advance gender equality and women's empowerment in environmental policies and programming. And this year, in 2018, we collaborate with the Green Livelihoods Alliance, and in this context, we support capacity building of both coordinating and country partners to integrate gender responsive action across the GLA. I am very happy to announce that today's webinar presentation will be given by my colleague Jackie Siles, our Senior Gender Program Manager. Jackie is an agricultural engineer by training and has over 2 decades experience working with IUCN on the nexus of gender and environment and development in the Mesoamerican, Andean, Amazon, and African regions. So it is my pleasure to hand over to Jackie now to talk about mainstreaming gender in the project cycle.
Hi, Jackie, can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can see. All right, you have the floor.
Okay, good morning and good afternoon to the people listening us today for this webinar. As it was mentioned before by my colleague Celine, the topic of this webinar is about how to mainstream gender into the project cycle. And I would like to initiate my presentation by first responding to the question, what do we mean by gender mainstreaming? Gender mainstreaming is a strategy that helps us to advance toward gender equality. In the framework of a project, gender mainstream means that we are going to pay constantly attention to equality between women and men. And how we do that? Well, we do it when during the preparation, design, implementation, monitoring, and evaluation of the project, we make sure that women as well as men are engaged, their needs and interests are considered, and both benefit in an equal way from the different projects that that we are going to implement during the time that we have the project. We also want our project to be gender responsive. And here, what I want to say is that in the project development, we are going to identify, reflect, and implement needed interventions to address gender gaps. And what are the gender gaps? Well, the gender gaps are inequalities or any disparity between women and men conditions and position in society. Gender gaps can be found in many areas. So when we want to do a gender responsive project, we want to do things differently. We don't want to do business as usual. We want our project to contribute to overcome historical gender biases in the project interventions. So gender responsiveness in applications contributes proactively and intentionally to advance of gender equality. So what we are trying is to not to harm, but when we're trying to do a gender responsive project, what we want to do is the things better. So, well, what do we win by having a gender responsive project? I would like to tell you that the studies from the World Bank has shown, for example, that incorporating women as an agent of change in projects that are related to water or to watershed management, these projects have been more efficient and more effective than the ones that have not been considered the gender difference and inequalities in the implementation of the project's activities. When we integrate both women and men into the projects, we open the opportunity for knowledge exchange among themselves, but also both can contribute from their skills and experience. Here again, there are also information that show, for example, in the case of fisheries and community forest management, the impact of having women in decision-making structures. In the case of fishery management, the capacity of the management committees to deal with conflict management has been increased. And in the case of community forest management, when we have women and men in these communities, what we have found is that the forests on those communities are better management, and all these contribute to a more sustainable use of resources. There are also studies showing how, taking into consideration the differentiated knowledge that women and men have in projects that we have been doing, let's see, in the Amazon region, they have been able to identify more species linked to food security. So when we include both women and men in the project, the livelihoods of both of them are impacted, and also their families. And here again, we have data that show how women and men distribute and use the income for the well of the family in different ways. Gender responsive, a gender responsive project seeks human development, which is normatively based on human international rights standards and operationally directed to promote and protect human rights. So if we add all the things that I just have mentioned, we will end with a process that will contribute to and prevent the increase of these gender inequalities. Well, having in mind the meaning of gender mainstreaming, what is a gender responsive project, and what do we win considering gender issues in our project, I think we can move now to talk about how can we include gender perspective in the project development cycle. And I know that you are working in projects, and you have probably developed many different projects during your work. So I want to remind you that generally the development of project has a phase of designing. We write the project document, then we implement it, monitoring and evaluate, and then at the end, we close the project. And in the development of all these phases, there are different activities that that can take place to ensure that we are considering gender issues. So I'm going to start now uh, with the first phase, and is in the first phase of a project is the project design, and one of the fundamental activities that we need to conduct in this time is the gender analysis. Okay, so what is the gender analysis? The gender analysis is a tool to identify the root causes of existing gender inequalities or barriers that women empowerment have into the local context. Uh, the gender analysis is done by examining the difference between the roles that women and men play in communities in societies. the different levels of power that they hold, the different needs, constraints, and also opportunities, and the impact of these differences in their livelihoods. A gender analysis can also identify potential impacts and or risk of the, the activities that exclude women during the planet or strategies of the project. So I could say that the gender analysis is a tool which help us to better understand the context. It gave us, like I would say, the whole picture, a really holistic view of how people relate among themselves, but also how they relate with the environment and with the resources into the environment. So how do we do a gender analysis? Um, Well, developing a gender analysis will require to get information from the context in which the project uh, will take or is taking place. In this case, in the case of the gender analysis, the information can be gathered from primary sources. This can be done, for example, with individuals or focal groups of the stakeholders that we have in the communities. Here, I think it's important that you remember that when we have, for example, focal groups, sometimes it is important to have focal groups only with women or only with men, or sometimes it's also good to have mixed groups for the focal groups. And this is, we tend to have, for example, focal groups of only women because sometimes when women are together, they are more open to share and to talk about the things that they need, they are interested in. In the case of the interview, it is also important that you consider that to consider to have equal number of women and men when you do the interview at the community level. We also have here participatory research and surveys that can also be used as a means to gather information from primary sources. Well, we also can gather information from secondary data. And examples of these can be sectoral policies. Here we will like to recommend you not only to review, the policies related to the environmental sector, agriculture, water, but also to see the policies related to issues of social issues and gender issues, because at the end, the implementation of our project is going to impact both of those policies. And sometimes we can also, when we start looking for secondary data, we can find an analysis of at the regional or even at the country level of gender analysis, and or we can also find gender analysis from a sector. So this can provide us with really useful information that we can use. And there's always, articles, demographic and statistic data that can be useful for us when we are trying to gather information. Generally, gender analysis could have 6 different areas. You can see here in this slide what are the 6 different areas where you need to collect information. What I'm going to do now is to explain why one by one, so you will have a better idea of what are the things that we will look forward in each one of these areas. Well, the first one relates to laws and legal rights and policies. This first area is one that generally is missing from most of the analysis done in the projects. And here we are interested, for example, in knowing what are the laws, the policies in relation to gender and women at the national and local level, like I mentioned it before. We all know, and this is something that we have experienced, that in most of the countries we have national laws, but when we are at the local level, usually we find customary systems, and it is important to have a clear understanding of both of them. Sometimes we can find in the national law that women and men have the right to own land, but when you go to the local communities, what is happening is it's sometimes really different. And so it is important to know also who has the right to use all resources. In some countries, for example, in the Latin American region, women sometimes don't even have access to an ID document. And this is because they're not registered, so they don't even insist in the country uh, um, registered. So not having an ID can prevent these women for example, having a title for the land, because this is one of the first requirements that you need to have. And this can also, for example, impact their participation in organizations, or even in having a less possibility to represent them in any activity. Okay, so I would like to move now to the second area of the gender analysis, which is the division of labor by sex. In the gender theory, labor is divided in three different types of work. The first one is the productive work, and this work involves the production of goods and services for consumption and trade. This work, you get paid to do it. And in this type of work, women's productive work tends sometimes to be less visible. We have also the reproductive work, and this work involves the care and maintenance of the household and its members. Most of the time, this is not considered a real work, even by the women who usually or generally are the ones that are cooking, fetching water, collecting firewood, or taking care of the sick people, plus the work that they can do at the farm level. And the last type of work that we have here in the slides is the work related to the community work. This is a work that rarely is considered a work. And we know from our experience in the communities that there are many women and men leaders in the community that can spend hours doing this type of work in and for the community. When we do a gender analysis, what we want is to have a clear idea of what is the division of labor of women and men in these three areas. In the case of productive work, we can use the value chain approach for the different productive activities. This has been really useful for our experience in developing this kind of analysis. So we can know, for example, who is hunting or selling the meat, who is fishing in the ocean or at the shore, who are getting the non-timber forest products, who is involved in different activities in agriculture, who is adding the value to products by processing them, or who is selling the products to the final consumer. We also want to know who is in charge of all the reproductive work at home and how much of this work is taking the time of the people. And in the case of the community work, we want also to know how women and men are participating in the organizations and what are the kind of activities that they are also playing in these organizations. So questions like these ones that you have here on the screen now can give you an idea of what is the kind of information that we are looking for. So we want to know who does what and how it is done, in which time of the year or the season people are doing these things. This information is really important, especially when we are planning activities for the project. Because if the whole family, all the members of the family are engaged in many activities in certain time of the year, it's going to be difficult for them to participate in the activities of the project that we want to implement. We also want to identify how children, women, and men are participating in the different stages of production and determine if women and men are culturally excluded from certain jobs. For example, we had experience in some communities, fishery communities, where women are not allowed to go to fish. Or sometimes in some communities in Africa, we have found that women can be, around the forest, but they're not allowed to go deep into the forest. So for gathering this information, I would like to let you know that there is existence of tools and techniques that can help you to gather this type of information in a very participatory way at the community level. The next area related to the gender analysis is the one that is linked to the use, access, control, and benefits from resources. What is important to understand here is that women and men have different roles and that their gender difference and how women and men relate to natural resources. And for this reason is that we ask questions related to what productive resources do women and men have access to? To what productive resources do women and men have control over? For example, women and men can have access to the forest resources or the fisheries, but the control of decision over a specific resource can be different. And what we have found most of the time is that women are the ones who have less control over the resources. And when I mean resources, I also mean the resources at the household level, but also in the farm. And who benefits and how? But we also want to know, is there are any constraint there in the community that makes women and men not to have an equitable distribution of benefits? So if our project want to improve, for example, that I was mentioning you, the value of change of a specific product, and we found out that women are not well organized in one of the nodes of this value chain, it will require us to strengthen women organizations so they can be really effective and benefit from the initiative. Here again, I want to mention that you can find techniques and tools that can help you to gather this information at the local area, at the local context. Uh, Another important area is the environmental degradation. This can be related now to climate change that we all know we are facing in the world, but also uh, can be done because people overuse and degrade a specific resource. We know now that the environment degradation impact differently women and men, and that both can have different cope strategies to deal with the environmental degradation. Think, for example, what happens when a resource like water is affected in a community. That degradation of the water will impact differently women and men because of the gender roles. For example, in the case of women, women uh, will have, if they have to collect water, work probably longer distance because there's not enough water. Or what happens if the quality of this water is not good? It's not good. Well, probably at the household of those women, there will be more children and people sick with diseases related to water. And this will make for women to have more work taking care of the sick people. But in the case of men, probably the impact of not having enough water will affect their livestock, or they will impact also the crops that they grow. And here, another important aspect to consider is, for example, how the activities related to restoration or related to management of the resources can impact the work or the load of work that already women and men have or are doing. I would like to move now to the fifth area that we consider during the gender analysis. The fifth area is related to the cultural aspect, which are really, really important. And here we want to know if there is any cultural restriction by gender, sex that could have an impact on the access and control of some of the resources. What are the norms, the tradition, or cultural restrictions that affect the relation linking to productive of environmental aspects? Um, for example, in the coastal areas, as I mentioned before, sometimes women are not allowed to go and fish, but they can own boats, and they also process the fish. So knowing this aspect of the culture, a project can increase the access of women to get funds and get boats that can be used by their husbands so they can go and fish, and they can provide fish to women so they can increase the processing. So these can be benefit for both of them. And this case that I just mentioned is a case that we have in Ghana. But culture can also help us in the project. For example, in Senegal, women that are fish processors, they try to organize and develop this code of ethics to govern their trade, including regulation on the size of the fish cut and the safe and hygienic processing techniques. But due to the high illiteracy, many women were not able to read and adopt the code because it was written. So to make the code more accessible, the project staff translate all this written code into songs, into we call the song lyrics, even into the dance and folklore, and therefore this enable women to understand the code and to memorize it to the traditional forms of communication. We also want to know about the levels of participation that women and men have at the community level. So how are women and men involved in the decision-making process and planning at the household and at the community level? Do we have organizations in the community? How are they? Do we have a lot of women there? We don't have women in those organizations. What are the constraints? What are the things that are making them not be in there? But also, we can find what are the good things. We have a really strong organization where women and men are doing things really good. So we can also learn for that community of that experience, and we can reproduce those good things in other communities. So are some of the things that we are interested in the gender analysis in relation to social participation. So once we have the gender analysis done, we need to have present the information for the development of the project document. And how are we going to develop the responses activities, but also how are we going to develop indicators that can give us indication of how we are contributing to close the gender gaps that are in the community. So let's move now to when we write a project document, one of the first sections that we have to write is related to the justification. In the justification of the project, it's important to mention that gender inequalities are recognized and that the commitment of organization to transform these conditions toward one more equitable. It is necessary to describe how the project will promote gender responsive actions and what strategies will the project promote in order to have an equal engagement of women and men, but also that they will benefit. Sometimes, and we can also, if you remember when you write a project, sometimes you can also have this background information. And this section of background is really important too, because it's there when we can put most of the findings that we gather during the development of the gender analysis. We want to put there the information about the political situation. We want to put there the needs and demands expressed by women and men. We want to make sure that the norms of love that affect women and men have described there. What is the division of labor by sex? How they use and access and control of resources and goods and services by sex? And what are the demographic trends of women and men? We have migration, who migrate, things like that are really, really important to be mentioned in this background information. The next part is the development of objectives in the proposal. The development of objectives in the proposal states the desired ideal situation. In order to state a project objective, which is rendered responsive, it is necessary to state explicitly in the written proposal that the pursuit of gender equality is one of the guiding principles of the project. For instance, if we want to have if we want to have a general objective mentioning, for example, to improve the watershed management through the sustainable use or conservation of natural resources. This is a typical development objective for a proposal. We want to improve watershed management by using sustainable and conservation measures of natural resources. But when we have done the gender analysis and we got information, we can say a development objective that can mention, for example, to improve the living conditions of women and men in the watershed. It could be in the landscape or any ecosystem that you work in. So we want to improve the living condition of women and men in the watershed through co-management and the sustainable use of conservation and natural resources. So now here in this objective, we have what are we going to do in relation to the change of the people's life. So we try to combine in these objectives and then in the specific ones, these two different areas, the area of conservation, but also the area of equality together. In relation to the activities, taking into account information from the gender analysis, we will have to develop activities that contribute to reduce the gender gaps. So the activities should promote the equitable access, use, and control of resources. And also, we will have to have activities that help to enhance participation, that helps women and men to interact in a different way, to build relationships more equitable, to open spaces for women and men in areas like decision making. So it's here when we challenge you to think beyond, when we're talking about women, to think beyond the level of household, or even to think only in cook stuff. When we're thinking about activities that women can develop in a project, think in all areas that they can participate. Sometimes we bring activities, new activities to a community that have not been done before by a woman or a man. So if we're going to bring an activity, and I can give you, for example, for instance, an example like we did in the Central American region, trying to introduce this new grafting technique for cocoa production, that it was not done by women and men in the communities. And what we did was to allow the young women and men in the communities to develop this skill. So they became later owners of these nurseries where the cocoa trees were grafted, and they were able to sell it and to have an activity where both were participating. So this gives you an example of the things, the innovative things that we can do and to really promote a change in the community in a good way. Well, we are now at the level of the indicators. Gender equality indicators are very important in the project. Indicators should point out how far and in what ways the project achieve results resulting in reducing the gender gaps. For example, the indicator should give us information if there is an increase or decrease of women or men participation and benefit for interventions. The indicators should generate evidence of how we are advancing in our attention to gender in our project and the contribution of it for a more equitable and sustainable outcomes. I'm gonna give you here some examples of indicators that you can read where you can see what type of indicators we're trying to look for. And here, what I want to really emphasize is that when we are developing indicators, we have to have indicators for the change in those gender gaps. We have to have indicators that most of the time we wish them to be disaggregated by sex. Because when we disaggregate by sex the information, we can have a better idea when we do the monitoring of what has been the impact. We can keep tracking of the impact that we are having in both women and men at the community level. And now we go to the money. And the money, the budget, and the project is also very important. Most of the time when we go to the field and ask to the project manager or to the people of the project, why are you not implementing gender activities? And the first response is because we don't have money. So if we want really to impact and to have a gender responsive project, we need to allocate money for supporting specifically activities related to gender. But also, we have to keep in mind that sometimes we will need to add or to keep more money, to add more money to a specific activity that is not related. For example, we have a activity related to capacity building. My experience is that when we have a capacity building activity and the activity will take more than 2 days, most of the time we will have women coming to the project, to this activity with children. And well, we will need to have more people attending, so we will need to have more money. We need to allocate more money for food, and probably we will need to buy things to keep the kids entertained, because it is really hard to have 2 kids and be in a workshop at the same time. So these are the kind of activities that you need to keep in mind in the budget. For that type of activities. And what happens if we don't mainstream gender into the project? I think we could face some risks, like, for example, not having all the people participating. I have found out that in most of the communities, especially in rural areas, women sometimes are more than 50% of the people that live there. And in hard conditions, sometimes we find only women there because the men have migrated. So if we are not taking into consideration more than half of the population that is in the community in our activities of the project, we are not promoting the benefit of all the people. So in a way, we can be contributing to discriminate women by marginalizing them from the activities or from the decision-making process in relation to any resource like forests, or we can even maintain inequalities in relation to, for example, land rights. So these are some examples of risks that we can face. But also, we are not impacting the livelihood of people. Women and men in most of the countries, when we have projects, uh, they have a close relationship with natural resources. And if we don't include both of them, we will have limited impact on their livelihoods. And the possibility of the project contributing to, for example, reduce poverty will be affected. The effectiveness of the project will be also limited because one of the principles of a project that is gender responsive is that we are going to include all the stakeholder needs and priorities and interests in the process. To be gender responsive, we require that governmental institutions, our all NGOs, and even the local organizations mainstream gender into their projects and activities, but it will also require them to start an internal process of institutionalizing gender into their organizations. And finally, I think it's really important that you know that there are many donors interested in promoting gender equality, and many financial institutions are now developing gender policies. And if we do not include both women and men in our projects, we could be not giving them the chance to access to financial opportunities that can help them to have a better life and help us to restore the degraded environment or the not sustainable use of the resources that they need for their livelihoods. And last but not least, as I could say, I just want to emphasize that mainstreaming gender into a project, in the project cycle, even into the implementation, it's not a recipe. What I mean here is that we cannot copy everything from one place to another. And this is because reality is complex. It's really different. And the social conditions can vary from one country to another country, and even in the same country, it's not the same in the north part of the country than in the south. So we must have the capacity to adapt all this information that has been previously mentioned, and sometimes we must be really creative and to think, like I said, out of the box to try to do things and adjust things to the condition where we are living. And please do not forget that uh, it is better to mainstream gender since the beginning of the project design, and that gender is not an appendix. It's not something that we add when the project is done. No, so gender mainstreaming is something that takes place during the whole process of the project development, as you just saw during my presentation. But also, it is important that you do not forget this, and that promoting gender equality is a responsibility of all of us. And this is something that is happening to me when I go to the field. And it is that the project has a gender person that is a specialist. And every time that you talk about gender, they say, oh, this person is the one in charge. So this is not the way to do it. And in a project, all the staff need to have develop their skills and knowledge and how to mainstream gender. And this is something that is really important and we cannot forget. We all have the responsibility, the ethical and moral responsibility to contribute toward a more equitable world. And with this, I would like to finish my presentation and allow you to comment or to provide your questions. And I hope that my presentation has been really useful for you all. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Jackie, for your presentation. I think we got a lot of very interesting information there. Because we've been speaking a little bit slower, we took a little longer for the presentation than anticipated, but I would really like to give the opportunity to participants to ask questions if there are any. So please type your question in the chat box or raise your hand if you prefer to speak, and we can unmute your microphone and give you an opportunity to ask your question verbally if you prefer. So maybe while I give you an opportunity to ask your questions, we'll get started with one, Jackie.
Mhm.
I was wondering if maybe from your experience, if you can give an example of a project that was particularly successful in mainstreaming gender throughout the entire project cycle, and what specifically about that project was it that made it successful?
We have a watershed management project in the Honduras area country that was really successful. And the thing that helped them to be really successful was that they include and did a really good gender analysis since the beginning. And I think if I don't know if we start the things good, we will end it good. So they really did a good gender analysis, and they were able to really find what was the gender gaps that were present. And they found, for example, that the women have a really low participation in the committees that were done at the watershed management scale, right? And and because they found this, they started to build the capacity of women, to organize them, to develop the capacity. They learn about policies, they learn about water, they learn about sanitation, because when they ask women to about their interests and needs, women were thinking more beyond water. They were thinking about the community, the health. So they start, providing all these skills and needs that women had. And another thing that was really useful was that also they have to work with men, because they found out that the men, for example, in the community, there were a lot of problems with alcoholism, that the men have there were a lot of gender-based violence, things like that. So they started also working with men. So they start developing their sensitive about how they need to change this construction of masculinity that have prevent them to have a relationship more equal with their women, but also to enjoy more issues like parenthood with their children. So I think this project of watershed management, that they thought more than just providing water to the people, that they took into consideration the needs and the specific conditions and problems that women and men were facing. And they also gave them, the community, the power and the money to decide what they want to do after they have been through this whole process. And I'm talking here about 10 years, that helped them to really do a really good management of the watershed. This is an example that I have. I hope that it helps.
Thank you very, very much, Jackie. That was a very interesting example. We have some people who have raised their hand. So Emanuela has raised her hand. So I will unmute her and give her the opportunity to ask a question. So please go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much. Can you hear me, please?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, so the example that Jackie just gave, he said women in watershed management, and they were able to build their capacity. What the problem has to do with the cultural setting, the tradition of the people. And you can't change the culture or the tradition of the people overnight. And usually projects last for maybe 4 years, 5 years maximum. And in that case, how do you incorporate that gender session into the project?
Yes, thanks. It's a really interesting question. We have projects that that stayed in the community for a short time, and sometimes we need to think in a process. Social changes take time, and that's why I like to uh, develop the capacities of the people in the community and to make them go through their own process of changing through the time. When we develop the capacities of the people and there is understand there are social constraints that have built through the time and that they need to change that because we have helped them to understand that, it helps us better to change things. So we are going to be there a few times in a project. But if we have the capacity of develop those things in people, when you are gone, the next project that will come, they will tell the project what they need and what they need to be changed in order to really change these cultural constraints that they face. So we need a lot of education on the people, but we need also a lot of activities that help them to empower and to understand the condition and the need to change that, because that condition is not allowing them to fully develop and to enjoy their rights.
Perfect. Thank you, Jackie. Thank you. We had RJ raise a hand earlier. Do you still have a question that you would like to ask, or maybe was it the same question that was already addressed? I'll unmute your microphone to give you an opportunity to ask your question if you want to, or if you no longer have a question. I don't know if someone else has a question that they want to ask.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
I have one question. By the way, good evening here from the Philippines.
Oh, good
Um,
evening.
yeah. Do you have just wondering if do you have some list of donors or funders who are focusing more or highlighting gender mainstreaming?
Yes, we have, for example, the Green Climate Fund, the GEF, all those big donors, even the Adaptation Fund, are now, all of them, having gender policies and gender requirements for their project. So now, and I know more of the donors for the Nordic part of the world, they're asking for having these projects that mainstream gender as a requirement for their support. I'd also want to tell you that if you are really interested in knowing what kind specifically of requirement these donors have, the GEF, I can send you the link to the GEF requirements, and they also have a document that help the countries to develop their proposals with the gender lens, like we said. This is also for the Green Climate Fund, so I can share that.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Jackie. We can definitely include that link when we send out the email with the recordings. So I think we have no more hand raisers or questions at this point. And because I'm aware of the time and the fact that people might need to leave and have other commitments, I will wrap it up for today. I want to thank all the participants for taking the time to come online and join us for this webinar. Jackie, I want to thank you again very, very much for doing the presentation and sharing all your wisdom with us. We're very happy with that. And also a special thank you to our translator, who's done a phenomenal job translating the presentation to the French speakers. And so if there are any more questions that we haven't addressed that you have after listening to the presentation, please feel free to get in touch and write to us, and we will try and get back to you with an answer soon. And so,
Celine?
Yes, Jackie, go ahead.
I would like to tell to everybody that there is a series called Toward Equity that we developed, and there is in French, in Spanish, and English, and it has a series of modules on how to mainstream gender into the cycle of the project with exercises. So please give them the people the link to these modules so they want to be able to have more information on how to do it.
Thank you, Jackie. Yeah, that's a good point. We are also going to share online resources with our participants very soon, which will include this as well. So thank you very much for pointing that out. And with that, I will close this webinar. Thank you all again, and we will write to you soon with the recording of this webinar. Thank you. Have a wonderful rest of your day, rest of your evening, afternoon, or morning, depending on where you are. And you'll hear from me soon. Thank you all very much.